Open your cerebral cortex and shift your lobes into upper beta phase, because you are going to have Bitcoin knowledge transmitted directly into your vestibulocochlear. Your host at Bitcoin Knowledge is Trace Mayer, an early Bitcoin advocate since it cost $0.25, but this is not intended to be investment advice. A doctor of jurisprudence, but this is definitely not legal advice. And an investor in core cryptocurrency infrastructure, including Armory, BitPay, Kraken, and Nitagio, but this is not a recommendation of those services. Here, you get fed via direct mind download with pure and free Bitcoin knowledge.
Okay, welcome back to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast. We have an excellent guest with us today, Eric Jennings. He's CEO and founder of Filament, who recently raised $5 million. Is that correct, Eric?
That's right.
Yeah, so welcome to the podcast. Can you give us kind of a brief overview, like what does Filament do?
Sure. Yeah, first, thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. In a nutshell, Filament kind of has this grand vision that's somewhat audacious and a little bit kind of out there a bit. And then we have kind of this practical, current, very typical use case focus. So we kind of have these two sides of a coin that we constantly deal with. And so the practical one is really we build an IoT platform, an Internet of Things platform that includes a hardware component along with some protocols. The simple goal is to help industrial customers connect legacy infrastructure. So these are companies that have huge amount of capital assets that are old. Sometimes they're 50, 60 years old manufacturing line or a factory floor or fleets of vehicles. And our device can connect to these old machines and actually bring them online and give them an API. And then there's efficiency increases and things that they can glean from that. So it's kind of our practical aspect. And then this big grand vision is actually a little more nefarious, and we get very excited about this. And that is it's our strong belief that the concept of a decentralized IoT is actually more valuable in aggregate than a bunch of silos, each device talking to its own personal cloud, and the clouds can't talk to each other. And so the devices that we're actually using for our customers today actually have a decentralized IoT firmware stack on them, including some aspects of being able to deal with the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, as well as some decentralized peer-to-peer transport protocols. So it's kind of a way for us to kind of realize this future while solving what many consider to be a pretty boring problem.
Yeah, so this IoT, that's Internet of Things for people that are there, and it's really kind of a buzzword topic in Silicon Valley. Why are you particularly able to work on this stuff? I was reading a little bit of your bio. I even read the Declaration on Device Independence, which I'll link to in the show notes. Your background with XMPP and Jabber. Why are you specifically kind of able to kind of spearhead this type of an initiative? Yeah,
it's a good question. We, our team and various people on our team have worked on the similar problem in other contexts for a couple decades now. Some of the founders of this team, as well as some of the employees, were founders and early employees at a company called Jabber. And you'd mentioned the protocol called XMPP that company made. It's an interesting story. So, back about maybe 15 years ago or so, for those who used the internet back then, back in late 90s, mid 90s, there was this concept of instant messaging. People today use Facebook Messenger or Google Chat to instant message each other. But back then, you had to use a separate application program on your computer. And the popular one was AOL Instant Messenger. It's called AIM. And it had something like 70% market share, I think. And you always had to use their system to chat. And so they were basically a monopoly, a centralized, location to chat. And Jeremy, our CTO, and a couple other people had this idea of what would happen if anyone could run their own chat server, and then chat servers could talk to each other. And then you have kind of this federation of chat and all these different communication channels between people, between countries, and AOL is no longer in the picture. And so they set out to build this company called Jabber. And the protocol that enabled that federation of chat was called XMPP. And what's interesting is that at the time, AOL was the monopoly, and then over time, XMPP became adopted and started being used by Facebook Messenger and Google Chat and a lot of other chat clients. That at one point there were over 1 billion people every day using that protocol through those services, and AOL was like less than 1% market share. So it shows what happens when you have kind of this vision of breaking things apart to naturally organize rather than kind of, forcing a monopoly onto an area. And I'm not necessarily against, large markets or large, capital endeavors, if you will, but there's some interesting things that emerge when you have a naturally distributed system that can start to build new value on top of it that no one ever really foresaw. And so that ethos, that DNA in that earlier project has kind of come through now on this new project, working, like you mentioned, into the Internet of Things. Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously you're very interested in Bitcoin and blockchain technology. Why is that? I mean, how do you see that playing in with, these other protocols in the internet and the other layers in the stack?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it's funny. We're a little bit different than what I think is typical. Well, not necessarily. I'll rephrase. There's a large populace within the Bitcoin community that's focused very specifically on the currency or the financial aspect of Bitcoin. We see Bitcoin as just kind of the first killer app built on top of this blockchain, data structure. And the blockchain is actually very interesting to us for other reasons besides value exchange. We have some very stringent needs around proving identity of a device. If our devices are truly autonomous and they can discover other devices and they can interact with them directly and they can actually eventually transact value if they choose to do so, there's this concept of identity, like who owns this device, who has ability to be the administrator of this device. We think the blockchain plays a very important part in doing that in a decentralized fashion. And so we're leveraging the blockchain to actually, it would be similar to how people understand how colored coins work. We actually save the quote unquote ownership of the device, cryptographically speaking, the ownership in the blockchain, and then the transfer of that ownership can actually happen on the blockchain like you transfer Bitcoin. So it's very interesting to us because to claim to be a decentralized platform, we couldn't just store all the ownership in our own servers because that's kind of defeats the purpose. And so we really had to rethink through the stack top to bottom, best practices from the current internet, like you mentioned, as well as filling in the blanks where there were centralized systems with decentralized ones, whether they are blockchain based or not.
Yeah, so I get a lot of people ask me like, oh, what can we do with Bitcoin? And I'm like, well, currency is just the first application. We've got potentially thousands of applications on how we can apply this blockchain technology. So let's get down to like the nitty gritty. Let's get a specific example of how we can apply this Bitcoin and this blockchain technology to a specific use case with an Internet of Things or with like a fleet of devices or sensors.
Sure. Yeah. So we have a handful of pilot projects, pilot customers we have now, and I'll use one of those. I'll obscure enough of the details that I'm not breaking any NDAs or anything, but it'll be a really good example of the typical inbound interest we're getting from very large customers leveraging blockchain. So there's this one group, I'll say, who wants to monitor power lines across a very, very large area. So this is a country that is huge amounts of rural area that needs to be monitored. And these power poles that are in this area fall down. They either rot or they get hit by cars, drunk drivers and whatnot, or just by storms. And right now it's so rural that it costs them something like $200 to $300 million a year to monitor their infrastructure, just the power lines across their entire country. And the power company pays for this, and they have trucks and they have people going out there, and they have to have, stations out there that their trucks can park at and stay overnight because it's so far out. And so what we've been working with this company is to, see what could happen if we could actually add our device on each power pole. And the device would actually monitor whether it falls down because our device has an accelerometer in it. So you could imagine like if it's mounted to a pole that's vertical, and if the pole falls, the accelerometer, changes its axis enough where you can send a message off. Our small device has a radio, a very long range radio, and has some of these sensors. It's a standalone system. And the radio that's on it can actually send messages up to 10 miles line of sight between devices. So it's very long range, very low bandwidth, but very long range. And so you can imagine having devices like ours on power poles gives you kind of a very large network across an entire, region or country. And how this plays into the blockchain is that for our product, we actually don't sell our product outright. We don't sell our hardware, but we do sell access to it monthly. And so, in this particular use case, this organization would purchase a whole host of our devices. We would work out how to get them deployed, whether we do that or they do that. And once they're up there, they start paying us per device per month. And as long as they continue to pay that, we continue to keep the devices up and running. So we actually leverage some aspects of the blockchain to enforce that monthly recurring revenue, because our devices fundamentally they can work on or offline. They don't ever require the internet connectivity in order to work. And so what would happen is that the company would pay us, and they can pay us traditionally, through a wire transfer or credit card or US dollars. It doesn't have to be Bitcoin. In fact, we don't accept Bitcoin right now for payment today. But they would pay us, and then what we would do is we'd update the actual contract. Some would call it a smart contract, and we can get into what that means in our world in a little bit. But we have a small contract that lives on each device. So we would update the contract, load it onto the device, either directly or over the mesh, from an internet connection. The contract can be any term, and when the contract expires, the device goes into reduced mode state. The contract is renewed, it's just like the data plan on your phone. So the blockchain is very important for us in that aspect, because we actually store ownership of that smart contract for each device in the blockchain. And so, out of the gate, Filament owns all those. But down the road, for an OEM type play, let's say a company comes to us and says, we want to install your device inside of all of our new vehicles. We can actually transfer ownership of that smart contract to them in the blockchain, and now they can charge their customers recurring revenue for our hardware and our stack, and we could take a small percentage or something. So there's this kind of higher order level of asset ownership and ownership of a contract, and secure transfer of a contract that the blockchain gives us a huge benefit in, that we would otherwise have to do in a very centralized fashion, and also in a very legal fashion, slow fashion. Writing up contracts, having escrow services, things like that. It gets kind of tricky when you do that. And it also means that, big companies would have to trust us, who's a small startup, holding all these smart contracts directly, which can be high risk. Because fundamentally these devices we build could outlive the lifetime of our company if they're decentralized. And that we think that's a very important feature. Yeah.
So this is a really fascinating area, because F.A. Hayek, he wrote about how it's this distribution of knowledge throughout everybody, and how everybody's got something that they know better than anybody else in the world, whether it's their own state of being or something else. And so really what you're talking about is being able to deploy these devices all over the place so that knowledge is able to more easily flow in our economy. So it's going to make the economy much more efficient.
Indeed,
right?
Indeed, yeah.
Like the example with the power line. I mean, how, in order to gain the knowledge that a power line has fallen down right now, they have to send out trucks and individuals, and they have to negotiate employment contracts and per diem and all this stuff in order to acquire that knowledge. Whereas you're basically saying, hey, look, we can automate all of this and do it extremely cheaply. And then not only that, we can deploy the device, and then you can actually interact directly with the device to pay to acquire that knowledge.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And what's really interesting now, right, just like any free market, when you have these devices deployed all over a large region, if they are truly autonomous, they can accept payment from more than one buyer for additional data that's on that sensor, as long as the original buyer is getting the data and the value that they've paid for. And there's a quality of service guarantee or a service level agreement we would guarantee. But, if you imagine this entire area with this network that's deployed that has devices that are probably hardly ever sending data, except for when a pole falls, which is unusual, but happens, there's an almost 100% capacity network sitting there that perhaps FedEx needed to send a message from the outback, way back in the field somewhere, over to maybe an SMS type message that goes to the mesh. That would give them a huge additional ability to pay that device. Hey, send this message, guaranteed. Maybe it's I don't know. Maybe it's 1 millibitcoin or something. I don't know, but it's they could pay in whatever capacity they needed to. The device can now actually be its own agent within a market for sending data or giving out sensor data that it creates itself, because our devices have 4 or 5 sensors on them in addition to the accelerometer. It has like light, temperature, and humidity. So if someone wanted to get the temperature data all across the entire country, they could do so by essentially paying the devices for that data. The devices become agents within a market, essentially.
Yeah, I think this is just absolutely fascinating because I think it's 30 years ago, the CEO of FedEx, using FedEx as the example, he said that information about the package was almost, if not more important than the package itself.
Indeed. Yes.
And just with Bitcoin, I mean, I was presenting at a conference over in Europe, and the chief legal counsel for the U.S. Fed happened to be there. And during his presentation, he said, it's absolutely ridiculous that we can track a $5 package, but we can't track a $500,000 wire transfer.
Right.
And now, which is very ironic when you think about
it.
But I mean, that's what we're beginning to see, right? We're like all of these innovations in financial technology and fintech. Not only are we going to be able to track the $500,000 wire transfer, but you're talking about we're going to be able to track like these payments of fractions of a penny to a device in order to acquire the relative humidity out in the middle of nowhere if wanted, right?
That's right. Exactly. If there's a market for it, that's right. It's available.
So are these devices also going to be able to function as like oracles for other smart contracts that might be out there? Because if we got these devices deployed all over the place and we've got smart contracts that are prediction markets on the weather, for example, would these devices then be able to serve as oracles for those types of smart contracts?
Yeah. That's how we see this playing out, or at least one possible avenue that this could play out in is that when, oracles that are most close to the data that they need to provide as source of truth are usually the most reliable ones, obviously. And so we could see these as being a very good play for being, presenting as oracles and possibly even charging for that functionality as kind of a source of truth. And there's some details in the technology to make sure that works right. Like there's actually some, electrical engineering tech that needs to go in to make sure that, your humidity sensor is accurate and precise, because things can be precise and be inaccurate, right? You can have 5 decimal places and be off by 5 degrees Celsius, and it doesn't matter how accurate or how precise you are. You have to be accurate too. So there's some things we'd want to make sure we get right, even up to going down the road of certifying or calibrating some of our devices to make sure they're within a spec that people expect when they purchase that data. But once that we go down that road, then by all means, they could act as oracles for other smart contracts, pointing to them to say, like, if the temperature goes up this amount, then, trigger the smart contract clause to execute and pay whoever needs to get paid based on that data.
Wow, very interesting. Could you talk a little bit about like this IBM and Adept, and perhaps mention a little bit about the Samsung demo that was at CES?
Sure. Yeah. So we're big fans of what the IBM Adept team has put together. It started out, to our understanding, as a research project, kind of a skunk works within IBM last year. And what happened is IBM had a team of like 9 or 10, I believe, headed by a man named Paul Brody, who's a really great visionary in this space. Wrote a paper called Device Democracy. It's available online, PDF. You can get it off of the IBM website. And it really outlined kind of what we're talking about here, but more specifically within the consumer space, less in the industrial space. But fundamentals were the same in the sense that if these devices can be autonomous, there's some interesting new things that happen. A device can purchase its own, replenishment for things that run out, consumables, if you will. It can check on its own warranty information. And if the warranty is in force still, it could theoretically request a service call on its own without, interacting with the owner of the device, the human owner, if you will. So there's some really interesting models and ideas that came out of the Adept white paper. What they then did is that they got Samsung on board to join them in a demo at CES early this year to kind of build out a proof of concept of this idea. I forget exactly what I was just told recently what Adept stood for, and I don't remember. The rumor has it that they were going to call it distributed IoT, DIoT, but it was too close to the word idiot. And so they decided not to use that. And that's when we suggested you should have called it industrial distributed IoT, and it would have been perfect. But anyways, that was just a rumor I heard, which made me chuckle last week. But long story short, Samsung and IBM got together and they did this demo that had the Samsung washing machine able to sense its own detergent, because it was one of those very fancy Samsung machines, their top of the line one. It would know when the detergent's low. It put the detergent into the washing machine. And when it got low, it would actually make a request and make a purchase for more detergent on Amazon. And then it would just notify the human owner via text message, hey, I bought more detergent, should be here Thursday, something like that. They also had some other use cases with the warranty, like I mentioned, the servicing, as well as the washing machine and the television, Samsung television, actually negotiating market price for electricity and deciding when each of them would turn on and run their cycle based on market rate of electricity in the home. So some really interesting concepts of like devices starting to negotiate and figure out what's most optimal for the goals at hand, and in 2 or 3 different contexts. And what's interesting, and rumor has it, I don't have any facts of this at all, but it seemed like the IBM Adept project and the CES demo got much more press than anyone was expecting. It was kind of this side thing. It was a skunkworks team within IBM. And IBM has a formal IoT group, entire, arm of their company, and they've put a lot of investment and focus on it. And the Adept team was kind of talking about this distributed, decentralized, not really anti-cloud, but not cloud-centric anymore, devices talking directly to each other. And, IBM proper is like very heavy on the cloud and centralization, at least they are today. And so it caused some internal discussion around the direction that IBM should go and the leadership it should take, if any, in this realm because of their current efforts. But at the same time, IBM realized there was a huge interest in this, much more than anyone expected. So it's, to my understanding, they've finally gotten to the point where they figured out how they're going to move forward in this, and they've kind of reestablished their intent to continue on this road. And we're talking to them now about how that will play out and how we can somehow collaborate, since we have such similar visions. But the Adept paper named 3 protocols that they saw as essential for this distributed IoT. And the first one was blockchain. The second one was this one called telehash. And the third one is BitTorrent. And so we've taken those 3 and kind of expanded to 5 protocols. Telehash happened to be the protocol that our team has developed. Jeremy on our team has developed. That's the next generation of XMPP. And so there's already some kind of cross-pollination there where, they were using a protocol we developed or suggested to use it. And we wanted to kind of build out on this as well. So it's just a lot of very similar vision. It made a lot of sense to work together more closely.
Wow. The coming of Skynet, right?
Yeah. Well, we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen, but you're right. That's right.
Well, I guess
it kind of feels like that.
Yeah, I guess not to end on a morbid note. What would you say you're most optimistic about in this space then?
I'm a huge fan of traditional free markets and, von Mises and some of these other ones. And I'm just like, I think about, he has a book called Human Action. It's a big tome. It's great. There's a concept in there that I use a lot in thinking about this space called praxeology. And it's defined basically as like people will do what they do. Psychology talks about why people do what they do. But praxeology just says people will do what they do, and they'll minimize their own discomfort. Or actors in a market, if you will, if you want to look at it from an economic standpoint. And it's kind of obvious, it's kind of descriptive, but at the same time, when you start to look at it through the lens of the Internet of Things and this huge, explosion in connected devices, there's some interesting things that start to happen and starts to leverage some of the bigger issues that society faces today. So without becoming too idealistic, I think that if we can build a decentralized IoT ecosystem that includes many manufacturers, many vendors, not just us, not just IBM, not just Samsung, but actually have this larger vision where we can replicate what happened in the early web days, back in the days when you could make a website and you could link to any other website without asking for permission, without paying anybody, without getting approval from your web hosting company. You would just write the HTML, link to it, and now you were linked. And if they wanted to link back, they could. They didn't have to. that kind of loose, very low friction environment, it's our opinion, led to all of the value that is built on top of the web today. Google's and Facebook's and WordPress and all of these different things were enabled because of that simple kind of openness. And we started looking at the IoT space and starting to see it become siloed kind of by default because for various reasons. It's our opinion it's because it's a little bit short-sighted. There's some value to siloing a thing. That's why Facebook is so big, but it's a short-term win, long-term loss. And so praxeologically speaking, we thought if we can have this kind of a bigger ecosystem, then there will be all entire new markets built on top of just like the Facebooks and Google's built on top of the web. What will be built on top of a decentralized IoT, where people will act to minimize their own, discomfort, and build new solutions to things like, can we fine grain monitor, climate change? And if we could, what does that mean? Are we close enough where there's a group of scientists right now that if they had fine grained data, they could actually crack some new discovery within that space that helps us move the needle on climate change, or you name your concern at this time. But we're optimists, and we think that it would be used for generally good, just like the web has been used for generally good and has really pushed forward entire society for better, we think. And we don't want to lose out on value on the IoT space because of some short-sightedness and greed, quite frankly, to get some short wins or some early exits. As a siloed IoT, space versus a more open one that might take a little longer to build.
Well, I guess we won't grouse about the bit license and all the implications it has to stifle this type of innovation. But, it does kind of raise an interesting possible future, where all of the food in our fridge is really just a microtransaction that doesn't even arise to materiality in terms of us needing to make or not make that decision, because it's the equivalent value of a fraction of a penny in order to fill up our fridge with all the food that we could possibly want. I mean, we really could be moving into an era of just massive abundance due to all these technological changes and robotics and the implications all that are going to flow from all of that. And then all of that being managed through, the algorithms that run our lives, being managed through these types of protocols at the end of the day.
It's true. Yeah, there's almost like a post-consumer society, perhaps. If we do it right, it could also go south. It could go dystopic, I suppose. Because there's a lot of power there, but we really do believe the decentralized side is going to be the safest against bad actors. Power concentrates. We all know this. We see it time and time and time again throughout history, and even with the Jabber days, right? Like, with Jeremy and his team, Federation was good. Federation was, anyone could run their own server. But what happened is that over time, Federation led to consolidation, because that's the natural way of things, it seems like, in societies. So we had thousands of servers, and then we got down to the Facebook and Google server farms, and then there we are with just 2 again. And so this time with Telehash, it really does break them down direct peer-to-peer. There is no server component within Telehash, unlike XMPP, which we think is kind of because we learned our lesson basically from the last one. Wow,
it's just been absolutely fascinating conversation. Thanks so much for being with us. And
of course, thank you.
I'll link to the Declaration of Device Independence post in the show notes.
Great.
And then we can find you at filament.com. Is that
That's
right?
correct.
filament.com, filament.com.
Yes.
And so we've had with us Eric Jennings, CEO and founder of Filament, talking about the Internet of Things. Thanks for being with us, Eric.
Thanks so much for having me.
Be sure to get a copy of the free Bitcoin Guide at freebitcoinguide.com. Got a question or suggestion? Record your voice at bitcoin.kn. Don't be shy. To help the show, share bitcoin.kn with friends, post about it on Reddit, and otherwise spam the interwebs. Your iTunes comments and 5-star reviews are very important to us. Please continue tuning in to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast, where we release interviews with the top people in the Bitcoin world. Now take some choline and let that Bitcoin knowledge consolidate.